Hi, it's Ed again from Wise Up. Sort of a bit of a different slant on today's session. We're going to be having a look at the history of money, where it's been, where it originated from, and we're going to have a sort of a very quick look at where we think it might be going as well. Because there's no doubt about it. I mean, we're all very used to the notes and coins now, and to a lesser extent, I suppose we're very used to chip and pin and all different methods of paying for the stuff that we buy. But of course, it wasn't always like that, and it's very unlikely to stay the same moving forward as well. So let's sort of wind the clock back to about 11,000 years ago. Now, if you'd have had some business to do 11,000 years ago, let's say you were a sheep farmer and you wanted to buy some corn, really and truly there was only one way to do it, and that was to swap. Of course, it wasn't called swapping, it was called bartering. So you had some of your sheep which you would swap with the corn farmer for some of his corn or some of his wheat or whatever it might be. Now, that was all well and good, and as I say, about 11,000 years ago, that was the way forward. Now, of course, there are a couple of inherent problems with barter. It presupposes that the person who's got the goods that you want the stuff that you've got. If not, then you're a bit stuck. So if my corn farmer doesn't really want my sheep, well, I can't really have his corn. The second thing was that, of course, there was no fixed exchange rate. So there was no rule to say that one sheep was equivalent to 500 kilos of corn or whatever the going rate might be. That was all down to what you agreed on the day. And I suppose the biggest problem might be, well, what happened if I had a really bad harvest? Not only would I not have enough food perhaps for myself, but I would have nothing to buy anything else with. And of course, if I was a sheep farmer, my sheep could be stolen, or they could all die from disease. So all in all, it wasn't a great way of doing business, although it actually lasted for the longest of any type of transactional currency that we've had. It lasted for about 7,000 years. Of course, there's one other problem that I've just really thought of with this. If I had people working for me, how did I pay them? Did I give them a leg of lamb once a week, or did I give them some corn to take home? I suppose that would have been the easiest thing. But if there were other things there as well that maybe it wasn't quite so easy to divvy up and give some away to workers, it was quite tough. So we needed something a bit better than barter, but as I say, that lasted for about 7,000 years. About 4,000 years ago, we came up with the idea of using tokens that actually had a value, or didn't have an intrinsic value, so had no value of their own, but they represented a value. And we can see on the screen there a picture of some tokens which were from about that period. Now you can see that they're quite ornate shapes. And if you think about the tools that would have been available 4,000 years ago, to carve those little grooves on and to make those small holes, very, very difficult and intricate work. So a lot of effort were being put into making these tokens, making them unique. Now we can't tell if the bigger tokens had a bigger value than the small tokens there. We just can't say. But what we do know is that those lines and the little holes that have been drilled in the tokens made them very, very difficult to copy. So that was our first real attempt to stop people counterfeiting. Now, if we'd have just left ordinary pebbles as our token, there was nothing to stop anybody going down to the beach with an armful of pebbles and coming back a millionaire. But because of all the work, the intrinsic difficult work that we were putting into these tokens, we gave them a value and a rarity value as well. So that was about 4,000 years ago. So we could now start paying people that were working for us in tokens, which they could then swap for something completely different. They didn't have to take our lamb. They could go to somewhere else and buy whatever goods they wanted. They could also, for the very first time, save for something. Of course, they could just keep that laying around in a box at home, or they could just leave them in their pockets or whatever it might be. But that wasn't very safe. What they really wanted was somewhere where they could collect their tokens and they could keep them reasonably safe. Didn't have banks, bear in mind, in those days. So what could they come up with? Well, what they decided was that they would go with a sort of a money box. if you look at that money box in front of us there, you'll see that it's actually made of clay. It stands probably about probably about 90 centimetres high, something like that. And you can see around the top there are some holes. Now those holes are absolutely nothing to do with money, because this is actually a first bit of recycling. That particular money box started life as a beehive. The bees could enter and exit the hive from the top there. And after the bees had left, it was recycled to form a money box. Now, if you think about it, that's quite a clever ruse, because people would not know, or would-be robbers wouldn't know, if that beehive was still full of bees or not unless he spent a bit of time looking over it. He certainly wouldn't want to be peering into it if there was a chance of a bee stinging him in the eye. So when we think about it, it was a pretty clever place to start putting their tokens. So that money box was around soon after those tokens, so about 3,500 years ago, something like that. So sooner or later, technology started moving forward. We had better tools, and the counterfeiters could start to counterfeit these tokens. So we needed to move on. And about 2,500 years ago, we came up with the first coins. Now you can see these are a long way removed from the tokens we were looking at. These were made in Greece, and they were made of silver. And you can see there's a huge amount of work that's gone on to making those coins. On one side we've got that turtle, which has been stamped into the silver, and on the other side we've got a sort of a hieroglyph on there, which would give us an idea of who might be the ruler at the time, and perhaps the value of the coin as well. And you can see for the first time now we've got rounded edges on the coins. Now that was quite clever, because the rounded edges meant that we could actually put them into a purse or into our pocket, and we wouldn't get our pocket or purse snagged on the corners of the coins. They were nice and smooth. Also, the amount of work that went in by the silversmiths meant that these again were very difficult to forge. And they had what we call an intrinsic value. Because they were made of silver, they had their own value. That was the weight of the silver. So people were quite confident of using them. The problem being, of course, that when people started getting some wealth and they were carrying their wealth around with them, no longer were money boxes good enough, not when it came to pieces of silver. These things started to weigh pretty heavy. So as people got more and more rich, then it was more and more difficult to carry their wealth around with them. We needed something new. We needed something different, something lighter that would have the same value. And about 1,000 years ago, we came up with a very first paper money. And that paper money was made in China. That was the first place. Now, put yourself in somebody's position there. They'd worked very hard for their silver coins. Their silver coins had its own value in silver, of course. And then the government at the time came along and said, right, if you give us your silver coins, we'll give you this piece of paper, and it's worth just as much. And yes, it was very intricate, as you can see from the printing on that banknote. But people didn't have any confidence in it. Why should I give somebody all my nice silver for one meaningless, worthless, in my view, piece of paper? So banknotes didn't really take off. And certainly in the UK, we didn't have banknotes for much, much longer period of time than that. So China were the first people to try it, but they weren't really very successful. We carried on using gold and silver. And those gold and silver coins were being stored at home. Now, there were people that were working with this gold and silver. They were called goldsmiths. And these goldsmiths were responsible for making jewellery, but plates and knives and forks and all different sorts of things. And as part of their job, they had vaults where they kept all of these precious metals. And they came up with a good idea of making some extra income. They said to people, why don't you deposit your silver and gold coins with us? We will look after them because our vaults are guarded 24/7. And when you want to draw the money out, we will give it back to you. But we will charge you a small amount just to look after your money, just to pay for our guards. But people liked that idea because no longer were they having to worry about the money they had at home, which could be robbed. It was a much safer place, and it was a small amount of money that they had to pay. So goldsmiths became our very, very earliest banks. But we still had this problem whereby we had no paper money. And we still had a problem that there would be no confidence in it. But the government came up with a really, really clever idea. And that clever idea was something called the gold standard. And what the government said was that if you have a paper note, you can take that paper note into any bank or goldsmith and they will change that paper note for its value in pure gold. So all of a sudden, this paper money ceased to be worthless. People started getting a lot more confidence in it. So silver and gold started to be used less and less, and paper money was used more and more. Confidence grew and paper money really took off. But it was really down to this gold standard that the government at the time came up with that really was the blue touch paper for getting that paper money totally accepted. And in fact, the gold standard lasted until well into the 1950s. So that gold standard lasted for a long time, but after that point, the government decided, you know what, everyone believes that the £5 note in their pocket or the £20 note in their pocket is really worth £20. We don't have to prove it to anybody anymore. The whole of society agree with us that it's worth that amount of money, so we could withdraw the gold standard. Now, the last big change came around in 1969. Until that point, we'd used a really weird system where there were 20 shillings in a pound and there were 12 pennies in a shilling, which meant that there were 240 pennies in the pound. Very, very complicated, especially if you're buying clothes, because you didn't use pounds then either. You used something called guineas, and there were 21 shillings in a guinea. So it was really, really difficult to do trade. So the government then decided that we needed to step in line with the rest of the world. Everybody else in the world seemed to use 100 small things to one big thing, just like the USA, who used 100 cents to the dollar, and France, who used 100 centimes to the franc. So there was a big standard being made where there was 100 small things to one big thing. And we changed from our system of 240 pennies in the pound to 100 pennies in the pound, the same as we have today. Now, whilst that's quite easy for us to understand, people back in the day were a bit confused. They'd never grown up with this idea of decimalisation. And we can see the picture of these two ladies here are a little confused how much their tins of meat are going to cost them. So shoppers were using these tables that were being posted in all of the shops, which would convert the new currency back to the old currency which they were familiar with. And indeed, for the first year, everything that was sold had two prices on it, one in the new style currency, one in the old style currency, so until people got used to it. But these people were actually very, very sharp, and they managed to work out the idea of decimalisation very quickly, so that by 1970 there were no old coins or notes around anymore. Everything was priced in the new currency, the new pennies, and from that point on it's been very, very clear. Right, so that's a potted history of what we've done up to today. Now, I'm going to leave you a timeline. And you can see down at the bottom there are the 8 things that I've spoken about. And you've got to put each of those things into the bubble. Hopefully your teachers would have downloaded this sheet from the website and given you a copy each. Take a few minutes to go through that now and see if you can pop the right things in to the right bubbles. And I'll be back in a few minutes to give you the answers. Right, hopefully you're nearly there on that little exercise. So I'm just going to give you a couple more seconds and then we'll move on to the answers. Right, so the answers are, well, 11,000 years ago was the barter system. So where we were exchanging our goods for somebody else's goods. That lasted for 7,000 years until 4,000 years ago, money first began to be used, but not in the form of coins or notes, but in the form of tokens. Once those tokens started to be used, then we wanted to save them. So money boxes were used 3,500 years ago. If you remember, it was the clay beehives that were being recycled to become the first money boxes. As tools were more widely used and people came along trying to imitate these tokens, we needed something a bit more sophisticated. So in Greece 2,500 years ago, silver and gold coins were used for the first time. Over the next 1,500 years, people's wealth started going up and we needed something that was a little bit more easily transportable. So paper money was used in China for the very first time 1,000 years ago. The problem was that there wasn't any real confidence in paper money at all, so it didn't really catch on at that point. Here in the UK, we carried on using gold and silver coins, and goldsmiths who were using those metals to make plates and knives and jewellery decided that they would offer the service of looking after those coins for people, and they become the earliest type of bank. We started to get into the paper money about 400 years ago by involving the gold standard, whereby you could take your paper money to any bank or goldsmith and they would exchange that for the value of the paper money in pure gold. It meant that people's confidence went up and paper money really started to be accepted. The last thing that happened so far is in 1969 the decimal system was adopted in the UK. So there you go, we get a pretty good overview of what's gone on, but let's think about what's going on in the future. The lady there mentioned Haiti and how cashless payments have come from there, and we can all think about obviously our chip and pin, but we've gone a lot further than that now if we start to think about it. We've got Apple Pay, we've got PayPal. In fact, some of you probably might even be using a thumbprint to pay for your school meals because that's individual. We've got retinal scans. Our iPhones can react now to our thumbprint and retinal scan as well. So we're really moving quickly into the next generation of payments, and we have to think about money as being part of that. So this generation now is very possibly the last one that will use notes and coins as we've grown up to know it. It'll be an interesting discussion to have around the classroom, really, just to think about where we go next. Where do you think it's going? Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's session on the history of money. If you've come through YouTube, please check out our website, which is wiseupfinancialeducation.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter as well, which is @wiseupme, and have a look at some of our other categories on there as well. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.